The wind was sharp that morning. I stood at Liam's grave, the ground still fresh. In my left hand, his tiny teddy bear. In my right, a photo from Emily's gala. Silver heels. Champagne flutes. Spotlights. My parents smiling behind her. They had RSVP'd no to their grandson's funeral. But they made time for the donor wall unveiling. Linda had texted, "You'll understand one day." This was Emily's moment. I was still in my black dress. Mud clung to my shoes. No one had even offered to hold my hand at the cemetery. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there. The silence around me felt louder than their applause in that photo. How do you grieve when your own parents pretend your child never existed? James wanted to come with me, but I told him I needed to face this part alone. I looked down at the bear. Liam's name still faintly stitched on the fabric. It smelled like baby shampoo and old memories. The same morning I laid him to rest, they were sipping Prosecco under chandeliers. 4 years of life. 4 years of bedtime songs, doctor visits, scraped knees reduced to a regretfully cannot attend text. Not even flowers. Not even a voicemail. I wasn't just grieving my son. I was grieving my place in this family. Maybe I had always been optional. Replaceable. Overshadowed by Emily's causes, her speeches, her sparkling gowns. But this was something I couldn't swallow. Not anymore. At Liam's burial, only Rachel stayed by my side. A friend, not blood. She whispered, "You deserve better than this." And for the first time in weeks, I believed her. The ground settled over my son's body. But something inside me cracked open. A question. Sharp. Unrelenting. If your parents skipped your child's funeral, would you forgive them or make them see the truth? Where are you listening from? Have you ever felt this kind of betrayal? The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon toast and old coffee. James had already left for work, lunchbox tucked under his arm, tool belt clinking. I sat at the table we bought 10 years ago, its wood now faded, where Liam used to drop his juice. His chair was still pulled slightly out. Just the way he left it. The morning sun spilled across the floor, but nothing felt warm. On the fridge, his drawings remained, a red fire truck, a stick figure family, always with me holding his hand. Not once had he drawn Emily. Not once had my parents asked to put his art on their walls. I used to think they were just distant, but now I wonder if they ever tried to see him. Or see me. When Emily got her promotion to VP, Mom posted 3 photos with a caption. "So proud of our superstar." She lights up every room she walks into. When I got my master's in counseling, I got a thumbs up emoji in the group chat. That was it. The group chat still pings. Emily sends updates from her PR events, dinners, panels, the occasional celebrity selfie. Mom reacts with heart emojis. Dad sends gifs. Nobody asks how my work at the middle school is going. No one even noticed when I stopped replying. Liam loved trains. He called them chew schools. Every Friday, we'd go to the park and watch them pass the bridge. He'd squeal, arms in the air, until the last car disappeared from view. My parents only came once. Dad said it was too cold to be outside that long. But somehow they stood for 3 hours in evening gowns at an outdoor gala in November. I opened my laptop and scrolled back to the invitation. The Emerald Gala, a celebration of change. Under the gold-embossed logo, black tie. Sponsored by Everett and Klein. RSVP by the 2nd of November. There at the bottom, Emily's name. Organizing chair. I remembered her saying, "This is my biggest event yet. Real movers and shakers. Don't be late." I had told her Liam was in the hospital. That week we were still waiting for answers. She had blinked, sipped her green smoothie, and said, "I hope he gets better by the 11th. I'll need you to help check in guests." As if my son's life was just a scheduling hiccup, I didn't respond. I didn't show up. And neither did they when it mattered most. When we were kids, Emily got the upstairs bedroom with the big bay window. I had the smaller one right over the garage where the heater clanked all winter long. She got ballet classes. I got hand-me-downs. She broke curfew and Dad laughed it off. Boys will be boys, but not with my girl. I got straight A's and Mom said, "That's expected, honey. You've always been the responsible one." It was praise dressed as dismissal. I thought maybe one day I'd earn their real attention. When I became a mom. But even then, at Liam's third birthday, they left early. "Emily has a speech tonight," Mom whispered, dropping the gift bag without looking me in the eye. Inside was a baby book labeled, "My First Year." Liam was 3. They hadn't noticed. I stopped setting the table for 5 after that, just 4 plates. No more hoping, no more pretending, but I still invited them. Still sent the texts, still tried. Even when I was the only one holding Liam's hand in the ER. Even when the doctor whispered, "We did everything we could," I had called them. Twice. No answer, not even a missed call return. Later that week, Mom replied, "Emily's overwhelmed with this gala. Can we do something for Liam later?" Later. As if grief had a shelf life. As if closure could be scheduled. I stared at my phone and, for the first time, I didn't feel sad. I felt erased. There was one photo on my parents' mantle, a family portrait from 3 years ago. Liam had a fever that day. He looked pale, tired, but he still smiled. They had cropped it. Zoomed in just enough to cut him out. At first I thought it was a mistake, but I checked the digital version. He was there. Their version chose otherwise. That night I sat alone in the living room holding the framed copy I kept in a drawer. Liam's face soft and full of trust right where it belonged. I lit a candle beside it. Not for ritual, but for proof. That he had lived. That he had been loved. That someone me would not let him be forgotten. Some absences are louder than any words. And some betrayals wear gowns, not daggers. The group chat had 78 unread messages. I hadn't opened it in weeks. Not since Liam's funeral. But that morning as I scrolled with shaking fingers I saw the photos. Emily in her green velvet gown, hair pinned into soft curls, standing beside a man from city council. Mom's caption, "Our girl making waves again, so proud to witness this magic night." No mention of Liam. No note of absence. Just smiles. Flutes of champagne, candles flickering on tables lined with golden menus. And one comment from Aunt Marley, "You both looked stunning. So sorry we couldn't be there. Be where the gala or my son's burial." No one replied. Because no one asked. I tapped the info tab in the chat. Emily active yesterday. Mom seen 11:32 a.m. Dad typing. Then gone. I didn't say anything. Not yet. At school I sat through parent meetings and cafeteria duty like a ghost. Colleen from admin touched my arm. "It's good to see you back. You're stronger than I'd be." I nodded, but I didn't feel strong. I felt like wallpaper present, unnoticed, quietly peeling at the edges. Rachel came over that evening with soup and silence. We didn't need to fill the air with platitudes. She just sat across from me watching the tea kettle steam. "Do they even know what they did to you?" she asked. I shook my head. They know. They just don't think it matters. That night, I opened an old photo album. Family Christmas 2019. Emily front and center with a microphone. Mom laughing. Dad clapping. In the background, I was kneeling tying Liam's shoes. His face half hidden. Mine completely blurred. The only one who'd taken the picture, Emily. I found another one, Easter brunch. Emily's quiche. Emily's floral dress. And a caption from Mom, "Blessed to be surrounded by love." I wasn't in the frame. Liam wasn't either. We had brought the deviled eggs, but I guess that wasn't photo-worthy. I closed the album. The weight of invisibility pressed into my chest. I wasn't grieving alone. I had always been alone. Liam had been the only person who looked at me like I was the center of his world. And now he was gone. I opened my email, typed in Emily's name. The gala recap came up instantly. Subject: a night to remember. Thank you. Dear guests, thank you for attending. Your presence meant the world. Special gratitude to our family who stood beside me in this journey. I reread that line. Stood beside me. A line written while I stood beside a child-sized casket. James found me at 2 a.m., sitting on the laundry room floor. "Babe, come to bed," he whispered. I looked up. He had no idea he meant nothing to them. James didn't argue. He just sat with me. That's what real love does. It stays in the silence. The next morning, I walked into my parents' house unannounced. The smell of lemon cleaner and pot roast hit me at once. Emily's voice floated in from the speaker. She was on the radio again, and this gala really wasn't about me. It was about change, about honoring the future. My chest tightened. Liam was the future. My future. Uninvited, unhonored, unnamed. Mom walked out of the kitchen surprised. "Sarah, why didn't you call? I wasn't sure you'd answer." She blinked. "Well, sit. Want some tea number?" She glanced at the radio, turned it off. I stood there. Hands clenched. Bag still on my shoulder. "You didn't come," I said. Simple. Flat. No room for misinterpretation. Her lips pressed tight. "Sweetheart, it was a difficult time." "Emily, stop." I felt the word leave me like a blade. "You chose her gala over your grandson's funeral." A beat of silence. "That's not fair. It's not." I took out my phone, pulled up the photos. "Then explain this." She didn't look. She didn't have to. She knew. I left without waiting for a reply. Drove until the road blurred. Until I could breathe again. That night, I stared at Liam's bracelet, the one from the hospital. It still had his name. Still had the timestamp. Still had the truth. I realized something. I didn't need them to say sorry yet, but I needed them to see. And the only way to make them see was to collect every moment they erased and hold it up to the light. The email came in just before dinner. Subject line, "Thinking of you." I opened it with a numb kind of expectation. It was from my mother. She wrote, "We know you're hurting. We didn't want to intrude on your grief. Emily's gala was a long-planned event, and you know how important it was to her. I hope you understand we were trying to keep things balanced." Balanced. As if losing a child could be weighed against a fundraiser. I sat at the kitchen table, rereading it twice. The soup on the stove started to boil over. James walked in, catching the scent of burnt tomato and tension. He turned the heat off and didn't ask anything. He didn't need to. The email was still glowing on my laptop screen. Later that night, I forwarded it to Rachel without any comment. She responded almost immediately. "This isn't support, it's erasure." And for the first time, I didn't feel dramatic for being devastated. I felt validated. That simple shift cracked something in me. I wasn't being too sensitive. I was waking up. That night, I sat down and printed everything. The photos. The gala recap email. The RSVP note to Liam's funeral. Even the comment threads from our family chat, so filled with praise for Emily, so void of anything about Liam. The pile of paper grew silent and damning. It looked like a file from a courtroom. Except the only judge that mattered was the version of me that kept forgiving them. James passed by and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You sure you want to do this?" I nodded. "I'm not going to let them rewrite this story again." He didn't argue. He just kissed the top of my head and walked away. The next morning, I poured my coffee slowly, staring out the window. The bird feeder Liam had helped hang still swayed in the wind. I watched a finch land and peck at nothing. Empty. Just like every gesture my parents had made in the past month, I picked up my phone and called Mom. She answered quickly, like she was expecting me. "Hi, sweetheart, it's been a while." I didn't exchange pleasantries. "I got your email." There was a pause. "Well, I hope you understand where we were coming from." "I don't," I said. "I really don't. Honey, we didn't want to cause more pain. That weekend was sensitive for all of us." "You weren't there," I said. "You didn't come." Her voice tensed. "You told us not to come if we couldn't handle it, and Emily needed our help. The gala was more important," I finished. "You chose her big night over your grandson's burial. That's not fair." It's not. I paused, heart pounding. You were smiling in photos while I stood over a casket. There was silence. Then carefully she said, "We didn't think it would help to be there if we were emotionally unprepared." That stung worse than yelling. They were unprepared for grief that wasn't even theirs to carry. I ended the call without saying goodbye. Sometimes silence is the only language left. That evening, I sat on the floor of Liam's room. The scent of baby powder still clung to the corners. His sheets were folded untouched, his bookshelf perfectly neat just as I had left it. I held his little pajama top and pressed it to my face. My throat burned. But no tears came. Just that dull ache of someone being cut out of their own life story. I remembered a dinner from the year before. Emily had announced her nomination for some leadership award. The whole evening was about her speech, her dress, her itinerary. Liam spilled juice on the carpet. Mom scolded him before I could even move. She didn't even ask if he was okay. She just reached for Emily's gown like it had more value than his hurt feelings. That memory hit differently now. It wasn't just favoritism. It was hierarchy. And Liam and I had always been on the bottom. I decided I needed to speak with my therapist. The next morning, I sat across from Dr. Sims, eyes tired, voice flat. I told her everything. The photos, the email, the absence, the excuses. She listened quietly, pen unmoving. Then she said, "Sometimes the grief isn't just about who's gone, it's about who stayed and how they stayed." I looked at her. "And if they never really stayed at all?" She gave a small nod. "Then you name it. And you stop chasing what they were never willing to give." I left that session with more weight in my chest, but also a strange kind of clarity. They weren't just absent at the funeral. They'd been absent long before. Liam had felt it too, I was sure. That night I opened a drawer and found the hospital bracelet. The one they never asked to see. I held it gently. It was small, almost delicate, like it couldn't possibly belong to someone so real, so full of life. But it did. And I had been the only one paying attention. I wrote my parents a letter. I didn't send it. Not yet. I needed more than words. I needed truth. And not the kind you write in polite emails. The kind you lay bare. The kind you say out loud in front of people who can't look away. I folded the bracelet into a velvet box. One day I would show it to them. One day I would make them see. They had erased us, but I was still here. And I was done disappearing quietly. The grief hit differently that afternoon. Not like a wave, not like thunder. More like a quiet fog that seeped in under doors, soaked into walls, and wouldn't leave. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a week. No calls, no new emails. But they were still everywhere. In the framed photos on my desk, cropped to perfection. In the Gala flowers that someone had tagged me in on social media. Even in the group chat, which I still hadn't left. I just muted it and let the messages pile up. Emily had posted a quote that morning. "We move forward not to forget but to grow." There was no mention of Liam. No mention of what she'd moved past. But I knew. I always knew. That afternoon, I went into Liam's room again. I opened the closet door slowly. Each hanger a memory. His tiny jackets. The red raincoat he wore on his last walk through the park. The blue sweater Grandma Linda never commented on. On the shelf, I found the train set. Still packed neatly in its box. He hadn't gotten to open it. We were saving it for Christmas. I sat down on the floor and placed the wooden engine in my lap. It was heavier than I remembered. And then it hit me. This was it. All that was left. His things, his smell, my silence. I had spent 4 years building a world around Liam, and they hadn't even looked inside it. James found me there a while later. He didn't say anything, he just slid down beside me, legs folded, one hand resting on mine. After a long pause, I whispered, "If I disappeared tomorrow, would they even notice?" James turned to me, voice quiet. "I would." I nodded slowly. But then he didn't answer. That was answer enough. Rachel called later that night. She didn't ask how I was. She knew. I've been thinking, she said, you don't have to keep waiting for them to act like parents. I let that sentence settle. I don't even know who I am without trying to be the good daughter. That's not your job anymore. What is? She paused, then said, maybe. Being someone Liam would be proud of. Not someone who keeps shrinking for their approval. That line hit me like cold air. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, I think I want to do something, not for revenge, just truth. Rachel didn't hesitate. Then I'll help you. The next day, I pulled out an old plastic bin from under my bed. Inside were cards, photos, documents, hospital bills, Liam's birth certificate, the pamphlet they gave me when we first got his diagnosis. I started organizing it. One pile for memory, one for silence, one for proof. I didn't know what I would do with it all yet. But collecting it felt like breathing again. Later that evening, I stepped into the guest bedroom. The one I used to think I'd offer to my parents if they ever stayed over. They never did. The closet was empty. I placed the bin there. Shut the door. I wasn't hiding it. I was preparing. 2 days later, a letter came in the mail. It was a thank you card from the Gala. Signed by Emily. Dear Sarah, thank you for your support, spoken or unspoken, of a night that meant the world to me. I know this year has been hard. I hope you'll join me in focusing on the future. There was no mention of Liam. Not even a sentence. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because even now they thought silence was grace. That night I lay awake and stared at the ceiling. The fan made its usual soft click. James was asleep beside me. I pictured Liam's face. How he'd squeeze my hand when he was nervous. How he'd say, "Mommy, you saw me," whenever he did something small and proud. Yes, baby. I saw you. I always saw you. I whispered it into the dark. And then for the first time I whispered something else. They didn't, and they never will. That truth didn't break me. It cleared something, like fog after rain. Sharp, cold, but honest. I sat up and wrote a note to myself. 3 sentences. They didn't show up. You survived. You get to decide what happens now. I folded it and placed it inside Liam's memory box. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about legacy. His and mine. I started with the voicemail. It was short. A message from Mom the morning of the gala. We won't be able to come today. It's just hard to shift plans this late. Hope it's a peaceful service. A peaceful service. As if I were hosting brunch. I saved the audio file. Then the screenshots. Texts from weeks before, me updating them on Liam's condition. Telling them the fever was back, that the doctors weren't sure anymore. Messages seen. No replies. I sent them to my private email. Created a folder. Labeled it for Liam. Rachel came over that afternoon. I laid out the printed emails, RSVP declines, gala photos, and the letter Dad had sent. She didn't speak for a while. Just flipped through everything. Then she looked up. This is something people should see. I nodded. I'm not looking for a scene, but I want them to feel it. They've protected their image for years, and ignored everything that mattered in mine. Rachel folded one photo and held it tight. You're not crazy. You're brave. Big difference. The next step was my lawyer. Not to sue. Just to understand my rights. I wanted to know if I could legally record a family meeting. If I could read a letter aloud without it becoming slander. If I had the right to speak without being silenced again. Her name was Laura. Divorced, 2 kids, kind eyes. She looked at the evidence quietly. Then asked, do you want public justice or private accountability? I want peace. But I'm not leaving the truth buried with my son. Laura nodded. Then we plan accordingly. I made a list. Not for revenge. But for control. I wrote down what I would say. What I wouldn't say. Who I wanted in the room, and who I didn't. Emily wasn't on the list. Not because I hated her, but because she would turn it into a PR moment. And this wasn't for a stage. It was for me. And for Liam. I also started journaling again. Late at night. After James went to bed. When the house was still and the grief didn't have to hide, I wrote about the hospital. The cold light. The moment I kissed Liam's forehead and it no longer felt warm. I wrote about the way no one from my family asked what song we played at the funeral or what Liam looked like in his final days. They didn't want to know. Because knowing would make them responsible. One day I walked past a florist and stopped. Inside, I chose a single stem. White calla lily. No bouquet. No ribbon. I took it home, placed it on Liam's windowsill. Next to it, I set down the hospital bracelet. And a framed quote that I printed myself: truth doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to stand still. That evening I wrote letters. One for Mom. One for Dad. Both sealed. Inside, I didn't accuse. I reflected. Described what they didn't see. The day Liam sang off-key at school and waved at an empty seat. The night he cried for Grandma but she didn't call back. The way he looked for their faces in the funeral crowd but never found them. I ended both letters with the same line: I wish you had chosen him. I also wrote one for myself. Not as Sarah the daughter, or Sarah the counselor. Just Sarah. It said you get to heal. Even if they never say sorry. Even if they never show up. You are still here, you still matter. James found me folding the letters. He watched, eyes quiet. Then said, whatever happens when you send those. Don't forget, closure doesn't need their permission. I nodded. And for the first time in months, I believed that might be true. I scheduled the family dinner. Neutral location. Private room at a small restaurant. No press, no candles, no performances. I didn't want to recreate a gala. I wanted to reclaim a voice. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't wear black. I wore blue. Liam's favorite. Minimal makeup, loose curls. A silver chain around my neck, his initials engraved. Not armor, just truth. When I sat at the table that night, I knew what I was going to say. I had printed the photos. Laid them in order. Folded my letter, kept the bracelet in my bag. Mom and Dad arrived 5 minutes late. Their faces uncertain. But they sat. They didn't leave. Not yet. I inhaled slowly. Looked at them directly. There's something you need to see, and this time they wouldn't be able to look away. Have you ever had to speak your truth even when no one wanted to hear it? Share your story below. You're not alone. The room was quiet when I opened the envelope. I had spent hours deciding what to include. Not everything. Just enough. The photo of Liam on his last birthday, wearing a paper crown. Smiling through the fever, holding the unopened train set. I passed it to Mom first. She looked at it briefly, then away. Dad cleared his throat. I didn't flinch. There's something else, I said, pulling out the hospital bracelet. The room stayed still. Just the faint clink of silverware from the main dining room beyond the closed door. I brought this with me to his funeral, I said. You brought excuses. No one spoke. So I kept going. I placed a printed screenshot on the table. Emily's post: thank you to everyone who made the Emerald Gala a success. Family, friends, donors, this was unforgettable. Underneath, the Gala group photo. Mom and Dad center frame. Laughing. I circled the timestamp in red. Same hour as Liam's burial. You didn't just miss the funeral, I said quietly. You celebrated instead. Mom's voice broke. I didn't realize. You didn't want to realize. Dad tried to jump in. We didn't think we were needed. We thought it might make things harder for you. I laughed, short, bitter. Holding your child while he's lowered into the ground doesn't get harder because your parents are there. It gets lonelier because they aren't. I handed over the printed emails. Every text I'd sent, updating them on Liam's condition. Marked as read. I asked for help. I asked for presence. And you gave me silence. Mom finally spoke again. I didn't know how to deal with death. I didn't either. My voice sharpened. But I showed up. I showed up every day for Liam. For myself. Even when I wanted to disappear. They looked down. And I knew for once they had no script. No gala lighting. No audience to impress. Just the truth. Unvarnished. I took out one last item. A letter. Folded. I wrote this the night Liam died. It wasn't meant to be read out loud. But tonight feels right. My hands shook slightly. But my voice held. I read. I carried him through every fever. Watched every breath. Listened to every whisper of discomfort. And when it stopped, when the machines went silent, I wasn't thinking about justice or fairness. I was thinking about how quiet the world got without his laugh. My voice cracked, but I kept reading. I didn't need speeches. I didn't need grand gestures. I needed my family. But you weren't there. And now I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not shrinking to fit a family that never made room. When I finished, I folded the paper. The air was thick. Heavy. Mom was crying, but I didn't comfort her. That wasn't my job anymore. Rachel had told me, "You're not responsible for how they feel after hearing the truth." She was right. I looked at them one last time. I didn't do this to punish you. I did this because silence nearly destroyed me. And I won't raise Liam's memory in silence. They nodded slowly. Dad whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't," I said, "but you can stop pretending it didn't happen." I stood up. Took the bracelet. Left the photos. "Dinner's paid for," I added before leaving. "You don't owe me anything. But you owe Liam a memory that doesn't start with absence." The night air was cold, but I felt warm in my coat. James was waiting in the car. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. I opened the door. Saturday down. "It's done," I said. We drove in silence. Then I turned to him. "I don't know what comes next." "You don't have to," he said. "You just had to say it." That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen. I placed the hospital bracelet beside it, then turned off the lights. The flicker danced across the countertops over the framed drawing of Liam's train and onto my hand. I watched the light move. And I didn't move with it. I stayed still. Present. The family gathering was scheduled for a Saturday, Midwest spring. Still too cold for dresses, too early for daffodils. We met at Aunt Marla's house, neutral ground. Her sunroom fit 20 chairs. Potluck dishes lined the dining table. Green bean casserole. Mac and cheese. Lemon bars. Someone had brought in a foil tray. I wasn't there for food. I arrived last. James came with me. He carried the envelope. Inside, photos. Printouts. The letters. My hands were dry from anxiety. I had forgotten to lotion. But I had remembered everything else. The chatter died when we walked in. Cousin June blinked. Uncle Mike cleared his throat. Even Emily was there. Seated at the far end, her phone in hand, unreadable expression. Of course she came. She always did if there was a room to control. I didn't sit. I stood beside the coffee table cleared of snacks. I placed the envelope in the center. "I have something to share," I said. "It's about Liam." Aunt Marla smiled gently. "Honey, we miss him too." I nodded. "Then let's not pretend we all showed up for him." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Emily straightened in her seat. I opened the envelope. Took out the gala photo. Held it up. This was taken during Liam's funeral. Silence. I passed it to the nearest relative. Let it travel around the room. Then I handed out the emails. The RSVP decline. The unread messages. One by one, they went around. Like communion, but bitter. "I don't share this to shame anyone," I said, "but to name what's never been spoken aloud in this family." I looked at my parents. I buried my son alone. And while I did, you were smiling under chandeliers. Mom's lip trembled. Dad looked at the floor. Emily crossed her legs. "That's unfair," she said flatly. I turned to her. "You sent me a 6-word email 3 days after he died. Life moves on. So, should you?" "Do you remember writing that?" Emily blinked. I was overwhelmed. I was hosting a citywide event. and I was burying my child. I took out the bracelet, held it between two fingers, small, faded. I placed it on the table beside the lemon bars. That's the last thing he wore, I said. Not a suit. Not a smile. Just this. Someone gasped softly. Aunt Marla wiped her eyes. No one touched the food anymore. I looked around. I've spent months grieving not just Liam but my place in this family. I gestured to the table. All of you. You share posts. You send flowers to galas. But when it came to showing up for someone who couldn't applaud you back, you stayed quiet. James stood behind me. Silent, solid. I took out the final item. The letter. I wrote this to myself. But today I want you to hear it. I unfolded the page. Read. To the woman who kept quiet to keep peace, you don't owe anyone silence anymore. To the mother who buried her son alone, you were never weak. To the daughter who is always second place, you are not invisible. Speak. Because the people who can't handle your truth were never protecting your heart, just their comfort. When I looked up, Emily's expression had changed. Not regret, just calculation. She crossed her arms. You've made your point, she said. I took a breath. This isn't a point, this is a boundary. You don't get to rewrite what happened. Uncle Mike cleared his throat. I had no idea they skipped the funeral. Mom whispered, we didn't think it would help to be there. I turned toward her. Then you weren't thinking about anyone but yourselves. The air was thick. Still. I placed one hand on the table. I'm done protecting everyone from my pain. And I'm done waiting for this family to see me. Aunt Marla stood up slowly. She came over. Wrapped me in a long shaking hug. I'm sorry, she said. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I nodded into her shoulder. It wasn't everything. But it was something. James took my hand. We started to leave. Before I reached the door, Mom called out. Sarah, wait. I turned. She looked older. Softer. Ashamed. We can't undo it, she said. But can we try again? Somehow I paused. The room waited. I don't need you to fix it, I said. I need you to remember. Every time you set a table, every time you light a candle, leave space for him. And for the version of me you chose to ignore. Then I left. Not triumphant, not shattered. Just free. Later that night, James and I sat on the porch. The wind was still. The garden lights flickered along the path. He handed me a mug of tea. I sipped slowly. Did you get what you needed? He asked. I got clarity, I said, and the silence feels different now. I walked to the backyard, lit a small lantern, set it near Liam's tree. Watched it flicker, not as a symbol, just a light. Because sometimes justice isn't about noise. It's about not being erased. Spring arrived in layers that year. Slow. Hesitant. Like grief learning how to become gentleness. The snow didn't melt all at once. It curled back from the sidewalk edges. It shrank around Liam's tree, first the soil at the base thawed 2 weeks before the rest of the yard. I sat out there in the mornings watching for green. I wasn't waiting for forgiveness anymore. I was watching something grow. James helped me plant tulips near the fence. I picked yellow, he picked red. Liam had liked both. We never made him choose. The wooden train now had its own small track. It circled around the tree, weaving between the roots. Every once in a while the wind would push the caboose just enough to creak. I didn't cry when I heard it. I closed my eyes. And listened. Not for what was lost, but for what was left. The day I returned to Liam's room, I didn't plan to do anything. I just walked in with a cup of coffee. The sun hit the carpet exactly where he used to nap. I stood there for a while. Longer than I meant to. And then slowly I began. One item at a time. Not as a purge, not as erasure, but as remembrance. I held his little jacket, the one he insisted was a superhero coat. I pressed it to my face, inhaled the scent that had softened with time but never vanished. Each toy, each sock, each scribbled picture, I whispered thank you. I didn't box up grief, I honored it. Carefully. Gently. I saved 2 shirts. One went into a shadow box I placed in the hallway. The other I folded into the pocket of my gardening apron. So whenever I bent over to tend to the soil, I carried him with me. I started volunteering at the grief center mid-April. At first I just set out chairs and washed mugs. But soon the counselor asked if I'd like to sit in. I said yes. Not because I had anything new to say, but because I had finally stopped being afraid of my own voice. The room smelled like lavender and old wood. Women came in with eyes too tired to cry. They carried invisible weights that I had once dragged behind me too. I didn't offer answers. I offered presence. That was what I had needed. One night after a session, a woman touched my arm. She was in her 50s. Worn but strong. She said, "You gave me permission to remember without guilt." I nodded. Because that was it, wasn't it? Grief isn't the wound. Guilt is. Mom sent a birthday card for Liam in May. No check. No attempt to excuse herself. Just 8 words thinking of him. Thinking of you. Always. It came 3 days late. I didn't mind. At least this time she came. I didn't hear from Emily. Not after the confrontation, not after Denver. A cousin mentioned she had launched a platform called Remember Well, Digital Legacies. QR codes for gravestones. She gave a keynote on emotional archiving. Apparently she quoted Liam. I didn't look it up. Because I didn't need her to name him in public, she hadn't named him in private. And some closures come quietly without doors slamming. James and I took a weekend up to the North Shore. A cabin tucked into pine. No signal, no expectations. I brought a book and didn't open it. We made tea on the stove. Watched the lake through rain-specked windows. Held hands in the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full. I wore Liam's locket beneath my sweatshirt. Cold silver warm center. Always there. Always mine. That summer I planned something I hadn't told anyone about. Not a memorial. Not a fundraiser, just a garden afternoon. I set up 5 chairs around the bench James built. Hung Liam's artwork on a clothesline between trees. Placed pitchers of iced tea and trays of cookies on the table. Rachel helped me string fairy lights the night before. James mowed the lawn twice. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. Women came from the grief center. 2 old friends from college drove in from Des Moines. Even Aunt Marla showed up with blueberry pie. People laughed. People cried. People stayed longer than they meant to. One little girl sat at the wooden train and whispered stories to herself. She never asked permission. I watched her. And I smiled. Legacy isn't what you build for others to see. It's what lives on in the spaces they feel safe enough to be themselves. That night I stood barefoot in the garden. The lights glowed soft against the sky. The breeze smelled of basil and warm grass. I tilted my head up, and for the first time I didn't feel hollow. I felt rooted. Some days I still miss him with a force that folds me in half. Grief isn't linear. It's seasonal, and sometimes it comes back when the wind shifts just right. But now, when it does, I let it stay. I make tea. I sit at the bench. And I let myself remember without apology. Liam's photo hangs in the hallway. No frame of gold, just simple oak. Not in a shrine, but in the light. Where I pass it every morning. Where visitors see it when they come in. And every time I say it soft but steady. You mattered. Some healing doesn't come from what's returned. It comes from what you stop giving away. I stopped giving away silence. I stopped giving away my place in the story. I stopped waiting for peace. And started planting it. If you've ever rebuilt from silence, if your grief was ignored but never diminished, you are not alone. Where are you listening from? Who are you remembering today? Tell your truth. We're here. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it grows. Sometimes it just stays. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of closure, healing, and empowerment after 40. And if this one spoke to you, share your story below. Because your voice matters. And it's time to be heard.